Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Now today we will be analyzing the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 13th June 2020. The topics to be discussed today are reflected on your screen and the timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Now the article related to Index of Industrial Production as well as the election of the mayor is basically a revision article. So please do not get a panic attack by looking at the length of the video. The last two articles are just a revision. So if you are confident about your knowledge on these two topics, you can very well skip them. Now having said that, today's discussion is going to be a long one, so buckle up. Now this article is appearing on page number 15 and it reads, reserves surge to 8.2 billion in a week, exceed 500 billion for the first time. Now as has been mentioned, the context of the news is that forex reserves in India have crossed the $500 billion mark in India for the first time ever. Hence, in this regards today, we will be looking at the components of forex reserve and we'll also talk about the reasons for such an increase and how this increase is likely to benefit India in the long run. And as is evident, this is going to be an important part of the economy section, more so for the prelims. Now, the three major components of the forex reserve include the foreign currency assets, also known as the FCAs, SDRs or the special drawing rights, and gold. Now, the first is foreign currency assets. Now, this foreign currency assets or the FCAs are the largest component of India's forex reserve. Now, these FCAs consist of the US dollar as well as other major global currencies such as yen, pound, etc. Additionally, FCAs also comprise investment in the US Treasury bonds, bonds of other countries' governments, deposits of Indian government with foreign central banks and commercial banks of other countries. So in short, the foreign currencies as well as the foreign government securities form a part of foreign currency assets in India's forex reserve. Now, even though the foreign currency assets are maintained in major currencies, the foreign exchange reserves are denominated and expressed in the US dollar terms. The second component is the special drawing rights or the SDRs. Now, basically these SDRs or special drawing rights were created by the International Monetary Fund in the year 1969 as an international reserve asset to supplement its member countries' official reserves. Now, basically what had happened is that after the collapse of the Bretton Woods exchange rate system, the IMF was converted into a type of deposit bank. And herein, all the member countries of the IMF would deposit currencies in proportion of the quotas allotted to them. So as you must be knowing, every country in the IMF has been assigned a certain quota. And this quota is decided on the basis of the size of the economy, openness of the economy, etc. Now, IMF pays a small interest rate for all these quota deposits by the country. And then whatever IMF is earning, IMF then lends this money to any other member country which is facing balance of payment crisis. And to operationalize this entire mechanism, the IMF allots an artificial currency or an accounting unit known as SDR or the special drawing right. Hence, this tells us that SDR is not a kind of a separate currency. Rather, it is used more as an accounting tool. Now, the SDR is basically a basket of 5 major currencies. This includes the US dollars, euros, the pound sterling, the Japanese yen, and the Chinese yuan or the renminbi. And though SDR consists of 5 currencies, it is denominated in the US dollars. Additionally, SDRs are also known as paper gold because it is merely an accounting entry or an artificial currency without any gold involved. And this SDR is allocated to the member countries in proportion to their IMF quotas. Now in 2016, India's quota was increased from 2.44 to 2.75. And based on this quota, we have been accordingly allotted SDR. Furthermore, you should know that this quota is also important because in IMF, a member's voting power also depends upon its quota. Therefore, accordingly, India's voting share is also 2.75%. Furthermore, the value of SDR is set daily by the IMF on the basis of exchange rates between the currencies included in the SDR. Now, there are certain uses of SDR. Firstly, SDRs can be held as part of the forex reserve. Secondly, SDRs can be exchanged into other freely usable currencies, which simply means that we can convert the dollar denominated SDR into other currencies as well, let's say the Russian ruble, etc. Furthermore, the IMF members can also use the SDRs in their transaction with the International Monetary Fund. And this basically includes repayment of loans, payment of interest, payment for increasing the IMF quota, etc. So therefore, if India has taken a loan from IMF, India can very well return the loan to IMF in the form of SDR. Lastly, member country can sell a part or all of their SDR allocations freely. Therefore, we can say in conclusion that SDR can be traded among the members, it can be converted into members' currency, as well as can be used to settle their balance of payment transaction or crisis. Now, there is one more component of India's forex reserve known as the reserve tranche position. Now, on the internet, various definitions of the RTP is given, which is very complicated in nature. However, I'm going to explain you the concept of RTP as is given in the RBI manual. Now, basically, the subscription of the IMF quota consists of two components. One is the forex component and the other is the domestic currency component. Now, under this foreign exchange component, a member is required to pay 25% of its quota in the form of SDR or any other foreign currency acceptable to IMF. And this 25% of the forex exchange component is known as reserve position in the IMF or the reserve tranche. On the other hand, the other 75% of the IMF quota is known as the domestic currency component, and it is payable either in cash or the government securities denominated in the member country's own currency. Hence, in the case of India, it will be rupee. So, since we can pay 75% of the IMF quota in cash or government securities denominated in rupees, this is known as the domestic currency component. Now, this reserve tranche is basically a kind of emergency account that the IMF members can access at any time without agreeing to conditions or paying any service fee. Now, in theory, a member country can withdraw or use its entire IMF quota. However, this 25% of the reserve tranche is that percentage of quota which a member country can use without giving IMF any service fee or any other kind of condition. And if a case happens where the member country is withdrawing above this 25%, then it becomes as credit tranche that must be repaid with interest. So this first 25% of reserve tranche position charges no interest. So in simple terms, we can say that reserve tranche position is that part of a country's IMF quota which a country can access without paying any kind of service fee to the IMF. Now, the RTP is a very technical issue. Until now, UPSC has not asked anything related to RTP. However, for your understanding, we discussed RTP. Therefore, very simply, we can say that the reserve tranche position is part of country's IMF quota, which is held or deposited in foreign currency, which can be used by the country without any service fee. Now, this is not the technical definition of the reserve tranche position, but is only to make you understand the gist of the concept. Now, as per April 2020, the current order of India's forex reserve stands at FCA being the highest, followed by gold, RTP and SDR. Now, let us talk about the reasons for increase in the forex reserve of India. The first is appreciation in other non-dollar major currencies. Now, as discussed earlier, the foreign currency asset is held in the form of major currencies like dollar, euro, pound, yen, renminbi, etc. However, it is expressed in terms of US dollar. Now, the value of foreign currency assets can change on account of increase or decrease in the value of non-dollar major currencies. Hence, in the last 2-3 weeks, the dollar has depreciated by around 4 to 5% vis-a-vis other currencies. Therefore, there has been an increase in the value of other major currencies, and this has led to increase in the forex reserve for India. Second is the increase in the FPI inflows. Now, in March 2020, the foreign portfolio investments had pulled out almost 60,000 crores from the capital market in India, which led to rupee depreciation. However, in the last 2-3 weeks, the FPI has now returned to Indian market due to positive investor sentiment. And this increase in the FPI inflows has increased India's forex reserve. Third is the decrease in the crude oil prices. Now, since globally the crude oil prices have reduced, this has led to a decrease in our oil import bill and thus saving us a lot of forex reserve. Fourthly, RBI's intervention in the forex market, where it has bought dollars, has also led to increase in the forex reserve for India. Lastly, let us see how this increase in the forex reserve will help or benefit India in the long run. Now, an important indicator of the stability of a currency is its import cover. Now, import cover measures the number of months of import that can be covered with the forex reserves available with the central bank of a country. Now, due to increase in the forex reserve of India, this increase has led to an improvement in India's import cover, which has now increased to 14 months. Further, an increase in the forex reserve also gives RBI the power to act against or to counter any kind of depreciation of the rupee. Lastly, the news of increase in the forex reserve comes amid the recent downgrade of India's credit rating by the Moody's. Therefore, the increase in the forex will send a strong signal that the macroeconomic fundamentals of India are quite strong, and this in turn will provide confidence to the market that India is in a very great position to meet its external debt obligation. So this was all about this topic. Let's take up our next news. Now, this news appears on page number 10 and it is with respect to the National Human Rights Commission. The context of the news is that the National Human Rights Commission has issued notices to the Union Finance Ministry and the IRDA over the demands for high premiums for Mediclaim policies for health workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. Hence, in this regard, we will be talking about the National Human Rights Commission. Now, the UPSC syllabus under GS Paper 2 clearly mentions statutory, regulatory and various quasi-judicial bodies. Now, since NHRC is an important statutory body, we will cover it from the mains perspective. Also, NHRC has always been in news because of its functioning. In 2016, H.L. Datu, who was the former Chief Justice of India and the then chair of the NHRC, called this institution a toothless tiger. And then again similarly, in 2017, the Supreme Court of India too seemed to support Justice Datu's remark when it was investigating the extrajudicial killings of people in Manipur. Hence, it is very important for us to prepare from the mains perspective the major issues and challenges plaguing the NHRC. Now, as far as the prelim perspective of NHRC is concerned, which deals with its constitution, with its roles and function, that has been provided for in the PDF and it is very straightforward. Hence, we will not be discussing that. We will only be talking about what are the current issues with the functioning of NHRC and what can be done to improve the same. Now, the first major issue or challenge facing the NHRC's proper functioning is its autonomy and independence. Now, very logically, the Commission is supposed to be completely independent in its functioning, even though the Protection of Human Rights Act 1993, the act under which the NHRC has been constituted, does not say so. Now, the NHRC is fraught with mischief at its very basis. Now, the selection committee, which is tasked with appointing the chairperson and the members of the commission, is dominated by the ruling party itself. The selection committee consists of the Prime Minister, the Home Minister, leaders of opposition in the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, the Lok Sabha Speaker, as well as the Deputy Chairman of the Rajya Sabha. Hence, it comes as no surprise that the NHRC's selection process is very obscure. Very often, the government does not even publicize vacancies in the commission. Furthermore, even the criteria to assess candidates is also not specified. As a result, appointments to the NHRC have been fraught with disputes. Hence, we need to diversify the selection committee for the NHRC so that the selection process can be made more transparent. Furthermore, there are two sections mentioned in the Protection of Human Rights Act itself which underscore the dependence of the NHRC on the government. For example, Section 11 of the Act clearly states that the NHRC is dependent on the central government for its manpower requirement. Hence, it is the central government which will provide NHRC with all the staff and the manpower required for its day-to-day functioning. In addition to this, Section 32 of the Act makes NHRC financially dependent on the central government because it states that the central government shall pay to the Commission by way of grants such sums of money as it may consider fit. Hence, even the funds which are required for the NHRC to function properly and carry out its mandate are to be provided to NHRC by the central government. Furthermore, even the limited funds which are provided to NHRC by the central government are not being used for human rights related issues. Large chunks of the budget of the Commission goes in the office expenses, leaving very less amount for other crucial areas such as research and rights awareness program. Hence, both these sections clearly point out to the fact that NHRC lacks administrative and financial independence and autonomy. The second issue is that NHRC lacks the enforcing power. Now, NHRC can only recommend the punishment or penalty on any authority for violation of human rights. Hence, NHRC does not have the power to itself enforce punishment or penalties. So, since NHRC does not have the power to enforce a punishment, it cannot provide practical grievance redressal to the people. Another issue is that NHRC does not have any independent or separate investigating agencies. Now, whenever NHRC has to investigate some case, it requests the central government to send officials on deputation to NHRC to carry out the investigation work. Now, since the police officials investigating the NHRC are sent on deputation by their respective forces, their allegiance lies with their home cadre because these people return to their home cadre after their tenure at NHRC is over, and this causes conflict of interest. In fact, the officials of the Intelligence Bureau are not even answerable to anyone, and there is no parliamentary oversight on their functioning, and many a time these officials themselves have been accused of human rights violation while they are investigating a particular complaint. Hence, the NHRC urgently requires officers of its own to carry out independent investigations, and the government should provide it the resource for the same. In addition to this, the Protection of Human Rights Act does not categorically empower the NHRC to try all those cases where human rights violation has been done by private individuals. Hence, there remains certain kind of ambiguity as far as the power of NHRC to try private individuals for violation of human rights is concerned. Thirdly, NHRC lacks specialized persons or people who have dealt in human rights violation. Now, the Act requires that 3 out of the 5 members of the Human Rights Commission must be former judges. Hence, there is dominance of judiciary in the NHRC. However, the Act does not say whether these judges should have a proven record of human rights activism or any kind of expertise in that area. And in fact, even for the other 2 members, the Act is very vague, and the only requirement it states is that persons having the knowledge and experience of human rights. Now, though for the longest time the dominance of judiciary in the NHRC has been justified on the grounds that NHRC functions as a quasi-judicial body, however, if you will go through its functions, you will realize that only 1 out of the 10 powers given to NHRC is actually of a judicial nature. Now, though presence of judges in the NHRC commands confidence of the people, however, their presence has yet not been able to justify why NHRC takes so long in disposing of the cases, which is another issue in its functioning. Now, in addition to lacking specialized persons having experience in human rights violation, the NHRC has a very bureaucratic style of functioning. Now, Human Rights Commission primarily draws its staff from government departments, either on deputation or re-employment after retirement. Hence, the internal atmosphere of the NHRC is just like any other government office. Strict hierarchies are maintained, which often makes it difficult for complainants to obtain documents or information about the status of their case. Furthermore, since non-judicial member positions are increasingly, the credibility of NHRC has come into question, and it is very often said that NHRC is nothing more than an extension of the government rather than being an independent agency exercising oversight. Fourth point, of course, is the delay in disposal of the cases. However, the pendency of the cases is increasing day by day. Another important point here is that NHRC cannot investigate or try if the complaint has been made after 1 year from the incidence of human rights violation. So therefore, if there has been a cause of action or an incident of human rights violation, a complaint has to be made within 1 year. So 1 year is the limitation period for filing a complaint with NHRC, and this too restricts its functioning. Fifthly, NHRC doesn't have the mandate or the power to act against armed forces. Now, a very large number of complaints of human rights violation are directed against the members of the armed forces, especially in all those areas where AFSPA is functioning. The Act very specifically states that human rights violation cases related to the armed forces cannot be tried by NHRC. The only thing which NHRC can do is to call for reports from the central government in such cases and then make recommendations to the government as to how to proceed with that complaint. Here too, these recommendations are only advisory in nature and the Commission has no power to enforce its decision. Next, there is always a delay in publication of reports by NHRC. Now, the annual reports of NHRC are delayed by 2 to 3 years, and this has been a constant problem. And last but not the least, another challenge facing the NHRC is that people in India have very low level of awareness as far as human rights are concerned. The reason is that awareness of human rights is not institutionalized in our curriculum. It is limited both in geography and knowledge as far as the public is concerned. In fact, the knowledge of human rights is very low even amongst the law enforcers like the police. 80% of the training of a policeman in India is devoted to regimentation, and a very little time is given to develop forensic skills or the human rights awareness in them. Now, as I mentioned, the other points relating to power and function, the appointment and the removal process of the members of the NHRC has been provided for in the PDF. Now, as far as the way forward is concerned, you just have to write the opposite of what is the issues and challenges. So, as far as the selection process is concerned, we need to make it transparent. We have to make NHRC administratively and financially independent. We have to give it proper enforcing power where it can enforce the punishment and not just recommend it. We have to provide it with a separate investigating agencies. We should allow that the Act should specifically mention that NHRC can try private cases of human rights violation as well. We should raise the standard of eligibility criteria and should aim that people from civil societies and NGOs can become part of NHRC who have a substantial experience in dealing with human rights violation cases. Furthermore, NHRC should be equipped to quickly dispose of the cases. It should be given the power and the mandate to try all the complaints of human rights violation against the armed forces. It should publish its report on time and should carry out more awareness programs. So with this, let's take up our next news. Now this news appears on page number 5 titled Samples from Lonar Lake Sent for Testing. Now the context of the news is that recently the Lonar Lake has started to turn pink as can be seen in this picture here. Hence various samples from this lake have been sent for testing in order to ascertain why the lake is turning pink. In this regard, we will be talking today about the Lonar Lake. Now, the Lonar Lake or the Lonar crater is located in Maharashtra and is a notified geoheritage site. A geoheritage refers to a geological feature which is inherently and culturally significant as it offers insight into Earth's evolution. Now, the Lonar crater was formed 52,000 years ago when a blazing ball of fire, that is a meteoroid, crashed into the Earth at an estimated speed of 90,000 kilometers per hour. It then gouged a deep depression before erupting and spewing molten rock to create a magnificent crest on the Earth. Now this is the Google image of the Lonar crater and it is in the form of a bowl-shaped depression with raised rim. So when the meteor crashed into the Earth, it formed this crater and then the meteorite erupted and all the molten rock from the meteorite slowly cooled and created this raised rim of the Lonar Lake. Now, as far as the chemical properties of this lake is concerned, it is called as a saline soda lake because it is both saline and alkaline in nature at the same time. So, in the beginning, it was simply a crater, and over time, the jungle took over, and a perennial stream transformed the crater into an emerald green lake. Now, the Lonar Lake is an exceptional bowl of biodiversity and has also been declared as a National Wildlife Sanctuary in 2015. In fact, Lonar Lake supports microorganisms which are not found anywhere else on the earth. Another important feature of this lake is that it is the only hypervelocity impact crater in hard basalt in the entire world. So, though we do have other hypervelocity impact craters, but Lonar Lake is the only one in hard basalt rock. So, this makes it special. Now, here you need to keep another thing in mind. Lonar crater, Lonar Lake, or the Lonar crater is not the only crater in India. We have impact craters or meteor craters in Rajasthan as well as in Madhya Pradesh only. So please do not get confused if in the prelims they say that Lonar Lake or the Lonar crater is the only impact crater in India. As mentioned earlier, it was formed around 52,000 years ago during the Pleistocene epoch. Another fact which can be important from the prelims is that this lake is surrounded by fragments of minerals like maskelnite. Now, maskelnite is a kind of naturally occurring glass that is only formed by extremely high velocity impacts. Now, those samples have been sent for testing, and that will confirm the official reason as to why the lake is turning pink. However, few points are attributed to the changing color of this lake. The very obvious option is algal bloom. Now, an algal bloom is a rapid increase or accumulation in the population of algae in any water system, and it is often recognized by the discoloration of the water. Second reason could be the change in the salinity of this lake. It has been felt that due to evaporation, the salinity in the water has increased, and this can be a factor behind the change in color. Lastly, this change can also be attributed as a biological one, because following the lockdown, there was no disturbance to the lake, and it has been stated that maybe the lake is naturally and due to biological reasons turning into pink color. However, we are yet awaiting the official reason. So, Lonar Lake becomes important from the perspective of the prelims. Now, let's go to our next news. Now, this next news too has been taken from page number 15, titled Food Inflation Accelerates 9.28% in May. Now, due to the lockdown imposed following COVID-19, the financial transactions in the Indian economy have been limited. Consequently, it has become very difficult for the National Statistical Office to come out with a full-fledged estimates of inflation numbers for the month of May 2020. Therefore, the NSO has decided to come out with a truncated report of inflation. And accordingly, the NSO report has highlighted that the consumer food price inflation has increased to 9.28% in May 2020. Hence, let us discuss CPI and WPI by comparing it with each other. Now, the wholesale price index, as the name suggests, measures inflation at a wholesale level, whereas CPI measures inflation at a retail level. Now, WPI is calculated by Office of the Economic Advisor under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, whereas CPI is calculated by NSO under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. Now, this is an important difference, so please keep in mind as to the authority which calculates WPI and CPI. Now, the base year for WPI is 2011-12, whereas for CPI it is 2012. Now, WPI has three major categories, which includes primary articles, manufactured products, and fuel and power. Out of these three, the highest weightage is given to manufactured products. On the other hand, CPI includes six categories, namely food and beverages, second, pan, tobacco and intoxicants, third, clothing and footwear, fourth, housing, fifth, fuel and light, and sixth is other miscellaneous components such as education, healthcare, transportation, etc. And out of all these six, food and beverages have been allotted the highest weightage. The next difference comes in terms of the impact the increase in the cost of food item has on these two index. Now, if the prices of the food items increase, Obviously, that would lead to an increase in the WPI. However, what is to be noted here is that an increase in the rate or the price of the food items will have a larger impact on CPI as compared to WPI, because CPI gives the highest weightage to foods and beverage category. So very logically, the impact of rise in the food prices will be much more higher in CPI as compared to WPI, because WPI gives the highest weightage to manufactured products and lower weightage to food items. The next difference is that CPI includes services. However, WPI does not include any kind of services. Lastly, as far as the role of RBI is concerned, RBI only tries to manage the CPI. Hence, it is the CPI only which is targeted by the RBI, because as you must be knowing, the Monetary Policy Committee of RBI has decided to keep the inflation at 4% of the CPI for the Indian economy. Hence, CPI is something which is directly targeted by RBI, because the Indian economy measures its inflation through the CPI. And the major role of Monetary Policy Committee is maintaining the level of inflation in our country. On the other hand, RBI does not target WPI. Lastly, let us talk about the Consumer Food Price Index. Now, the Consumer Food Price Index is calculated in the similar way as CPI or the Consumer Price Index. So, the base year and the methodology is exactly same as CPI. However, to calculate CFPI, we take into account only the food and beverage category of CPI. Now, within the category of food and beverages, we have further 12 subcategories. For example, meat, fish, fruits, cereals, etc. However, when we are calculating the Consumer Food Price Index, we only use 10 subcategories of this food and beverage category, because we exclude the non-alcoholic beverage and prepared meals, snacks, sweets, etc. while we are calculating the CFPI. Now, UPSC is unlikely to ask such a technical thing. However, since the news was about the Consumer Food Price Index, so we thought it is important to talk about it. With this, let's take up our next news. Now, this news appears on page number 4, titled NGT Directive to UP PCB on Medical Waste. Now, recently a petition was filed with the NGT regarding the unscientific disposal of biomedical waste. Hence, in this regard, the NGT has directed the Uttar Pradesh Pollution Control Board to take appropriate steps and furnish a compliance report by July 20th. Hence, in this regard, today we will be talking about the Biomedical Waste Management Rules of 2016. Now, before we talk about the salient features of the Biomedical Waste Management Rules, we first need to know what exactly do we mean by the term biomedical waste. Now, the term biomedical waste means any waste which is generated during the diagnosis, treatment, or immunization of human beings or animals, or during any research activities. Now, this is the abbreviated version of the definition given in the rules, but this is how much you need to know as far as the examination is concerned. Now, these rules are applicable to certain people and organizations and are not applicable in certain respects. Now, these rules are applicable to all and every person who generate, collect, receive, store, transport, treat, dispose, or handle any kind of biomedical waste, and that too in any form. Hence, these rules apply to hospitals, nursing homes, clinics, dispensaries, animal houses, veterinary institutions, blood banks, Ayush hospitals, research or educational institution, health camps, blood donation camps, vaccination camps, first aid rooms of school, etc. However, please remember that these rules do not apply to any kind of radioactive waste, all the category of waste covered under the Municipal Solid Waste Management Rules, lead acid batteries, hazardous waste, e-waste, or hazardous microorganism. Now, the basic problem is that in most hospitals across India, biomedical waste is not treated properly, and there are several cases of gaps regarding the following 2016 rules in reality. Hence, not following rules can be hazardous and can have an adverse impact on health and well-being of patients, doctors, and other workers at the hospital. Additionally, COVID-19 epidemic has further aggravated the issue of biomedical waste disposal. Hence, in this regard, the biomedical waste management rules become very important. Now, the salient features which we are going to discuss also will include the 2018 amendment to the biomedical waste management rules. Now, in 2018 amendment, the ambit of these rules have been extended to include vaccination camps, blood donation camps, surgical camps, or any other kind of healthcare activity. Furthermore, the 2018 rules stated that the use of chlorinated plastic bags has to be phased out within 2 years, that is by 2020. Further, the 2016 rules have cast duties upon the occupier and the operator of a biomedical waste treatment facility. Now, an occupier means any person who has the administrative control over the institution and the premises generating biomedical waste, has to ensure that there is pre-treatment of the laboratory waste, microbiological waste, blood sample, or any other kind of biomedical waste through disinfection, sterilization on site, and that too in the manner which is prescribed by WHO or NACO. Further, they have to provide training to all its healthcare workers for better managing the biomedical waste and should also immunize all their health workers regularly. Furthermore, the operators of a common biomedical waste treatment plant should establish a barcoding and global positioning system for handling of the biomedical waste in accordance with the guidelines issued by the Central Pollution Control Board. Furthermore, the occupier has to report any major accident happening in his or her premises. Furthermore, all the incinerators and other equipments which have been installed in the common biomedical waste treatment plants have to achieve the standards for retention time in secondary chamber and dioxin and furans within 2 years. This is a very technical point, you can skip it. Now, the biomedical waste earlier was classified into 10 categories, but now in 2018 it was classified into 4 categories to improve the segregation of waste at source. So basically, to make it easy for the occupier, that is the hospitals and other such institutions, to segregate their waste, they have been classified into 4 categories. Furthermore, the procedure to get authorization for handling and waste disposal and disposal of biomedical waste has been made simplified. Furthermore, the 2018 rules prescribe a more stringent standard for the incinerator so that we can reduce the emissions of pollutants in the environment. Now, the next point is important. It is the state government who has been tasked with this duty to provide a land for setting up a common biomedical waste treatment and disposal facility. Next is also important. No occupier shall establish any kind of on-site treatment or disposal facility if a common biomedical waste treatment facility is available at a distance of 75 kilometers. So you see, ideally, at every 75 to 100 kilometers, there should be a common biomedical waste treatment facility. However, currently in India, we have only 154 common biomedical waste treatment facility. And this, in fact, is one of the major reasons why we are unsuccessful in handling the biomedical waste generated due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, it is felt that if we want to better address the issue of biomedical waste related to COVID-19, it is these common biomedical waste treatment facility which will play the most important role in this war with COVID-19. Moving ahead, the operator of a common biomedical waste treatment plant has to ensure the timely collection of biomedical waste. Hence, the responsibility of collecting the biomedical waste has been cast on the operator. Next, it is the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change which has to review the implementation of these rules in the country once in every year. Lastly, the prescribed authority responsible for the effective waste disposal will be the State Pollution Control Board in respect of the state and pollution control committees in respect of the union territories. Now, these are the salient features of the biomedical waste rules. In the PDF, you will find in detail the duties and the responsibilities of the occupier as well as the operator and some other salient features as well. So you can go through that. In the PDF, we have also provided you in short the salient features of the solid waste management rules also. So please have a glance at both of them. With this, let's take up our next news. Now, this news appears as an article on page number 6 titled Stream Education is Diluted Education. Now, though this article is not very important as far as your GS papers are concerned, while writing an essay or even for your interviews. Hence, we will just quickly glance at the main points of this article. So, the context is that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the schools are closed. Hence, the UGC has now come out with a circular where it is advising the universities to adopt MOOC or the Massive Open Online Courses, which is being offered on the government Swayam platform. Now, the UGC says that you should use these open online courses for credit transfers in the coming semesters. Therefore, due to this circular, the author is of the opinion that these online platforms are now being seen as major vehicles of education, and he gives us basically two arguments against this kind of narrative. So the two major problems associated with digital learning is firstly that switching over to online platforms may lead the government to shirking its duty of expanding the university framework. Now obviously the government has the responsibility to provide for higher educational institutions in all the nook and cranny of our country. However, now since the government is trying to make degree programs available online, it would not be required to expand its university framework. Hence, the author says that education is now being peddled as a combination of content and consumption. Because obviously the content is there, but now education will be dependent upon how much the students are consuming the education or the content through the online platforms. And this in turn dilutes the meaning of education. The second major issue with digital learning is that online teaching is very unidirectional. Now, unlike in a classroom where the teacher explains a concept and then the students can immediately ask a doubt, ask a question, and the entire teaching process can be in a discussion format. However, the e-learning platforms tend to reinforce a top-down teacher to students unidirectional curriculum. Hence, there is no discussion, there is no interaction on online platforms, and the only thing which is happening is that teacher is creating or giving content to the student and the student is just consuming that content. There is no scope to inculcate critical thinking. Hence, a conducive classroom environment is lost. Hence, moving to a MOOC-based degree system will rob young teachers as well as students of the essential lessons in teaching and learning from each other. Therefore, in conclusion, the author is of the opinion that such online platforms should be only seen as a stopgap variance. That is to say, we should make use of these platforms only till the COVID-19 problem persists, and these platforms should only help us to get by under the lockdown situations. And once the situation gets back to normal, we should again go back and encourage the classroom environment, the classroom kind of learning. So this was all for this article. Let's take up our next news. Now this next news appears on page number 11 titled Government Holds Back Full IIP Data for April. Now considering the problem of COVID-19, the Government of India has held back the complete data related to Index of Industrial Production, saying it is not appropriate to compare the IIP data of April with that of the earlier months. Now, in a previous lecture, I have discussed what is Index of Industrial Production and have compared it with the Purchasing Managers Index. So, I'm going to attach that video so that you can revise it. The Purchasing Managers Index has been covered comprehensively in the September edition of the Focus. Now, the Purchasing Managers Index data is published by a Japanese firm called Nikkei, but is compiled by a company called as the Market Economics. So please bear in mind that the Purchasing Managers Index is not published by any Indian body or institution, but is rather published by a Japanese firm called Nikkei. Now, as far as the source of information for the PMI is concerned, the parameters or the economic indicators to calculate this data are based on monthly surveys of the various private sector companies. Please remember that public sector units or public sector companies are excluded from this survey. Hence, under PMI monthly survey, of private sector companies are conducted, in which data is collected by talking and surveying almost 500 purchasing managers of such companies, which are working in different manufacturing sectors related to various fields. Hence, this survey is based on the perception which these purchasing managers have about the conditions in that related manufacturing sector. Hence, these purchasing managers, who are the respondents for the survey, report either better, same, or worse conditions than the previous months. Lastly, you need to remember that the Purchasing Managers Index is compiled separately for the manufacturing sector as well as the service sector, but the manufacturing sector holds more importance. Now, from a prelims perspective, what can be of importance is the difference between the Purchasing Managers Index and the Index of Industrial Production, that is IIP. As discussed, the PMI is published by Nikkei, which is a Japanese firm, whereas the IIP is published by the Central Statistics Office, which is a governmental agency working under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. Next, the PMI does not track the actual production but is rather based, as we discussed earlier, on the perception of the purchasing managers in that manufacturing sector. But whereas IIP is concerned, the Index of Industrial Production tracks the actual production, that is the real output which has been produced by a manufacturing sector, is taken into consideration while compiling the IIP. Further, the PMI only covers 500 private sector companies, whereas IIP covers both the private as well as the public sector companies. The PMI covers both the manufacturing sector as well as the services sector, whereas IIP covers only the manufacturing sector and not the service sector. Now, since we know that under the PMI, the survey is only conducted for the private sector companies, hence the PMI is less comprehensive as it does not take into account the perception of the public sector companies. And on the other hand, since IIP covers both the private as well as the public sector, it is more comprehensive in nature. Lastly, very importantly, you should remember that the Purchasing Managers Index is not used by India for the calculation of GDP, whereas IIP is used to calculate the GDP, especially for the unorganized sector in our economy. Now that we know that PMI is not used to calculate GDP, the next logical question should be, for what is PMI then important? The answer to this lies in the timing of when this PMI is released. The PMI is usually released before the official data on the industrial output, manufacturing, or GDP growth becomes available in the country. To give you an idea, the PMI is released on 1st of every month, whereas the IIP is released on 12th of every month. So since PMI is released before the official data, it serves as a good leading indicator of the economic activity in our economy. Now, this news has been taken from page number 2 and it is with respect to the election of mayor and deputy mayor. Now, I have covered in detail the topic related to the election of mayor as well as the fact whether the election of mayor should be a direct or an indirect one. So, I'm attaching the previous lecture for your revision, but if you're well aware with the topic, you can skip this discussion. Before we start our discussion, let us very briefly talk about what are the basic problems facing the urban local bodies in India. Now, as the Indian cities are growing in number and size, there is an increasing pressure for better urban governance. However, the current urban governance in India is rather inefficient, has a lot of mismanagement, and also has overlapping jurisdiction. Because in urban areas, the jurisdiction is shared between the mayor and the municipal commissioner, which leads to overlapping. Furthermore, the problems in the urban areas is very different from that of the rural areas. Hence, what is required is dedicated efforts to solve the problem of sanitation, environment, water, sewage, etc. Furthermore, the urban local bodies today do not have sufficient finances to deal with the city problems, and this has even been ignored by the elected representatives. Therefore, taking into consideration the unique nature of problems which are faced by the urban local bodies, again and again there has been a demand to make the office of the mayor an elected one, and that too on a non-party line. Now, before talking about what reforms are required in the election of the mayor, let us first understand what is the current system of election for the mayor. Now, basically, most of the Indian cities follow the commissionerate system of municipal administration, which is basically a British legacy. And in this commissionerate system of municipal administration, the commissioner is the real or the executive head of the city, whereas the mayor is only a ceremonial head. Now, since we are talking about the urban local bodies, let me in brief tell you about the structure of the urban local bodies. Now, there are several types of urban local bodies. For example, the municipal corporation, municipalities, notified area committees, etc. Now, municipal corporation is basically created for the administration of big cities or the metropolitan cities like Delhi, Kolkata, Hyderabad, Mumbai, etc. Now, as you must be knowing, it was the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act which provided for the urban local bodies in the form of Nagar Panchayats, municipal councils, municipal corporations, etc. However, this act did not specify the manner in which the mayors or the president or the chairpersons will be elected. Hence, the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act left it on the states to specify and choose for themselves as to what manner of elections do they want for the mayors or the chairpersons of this urban local bodies. Now, currently in India, majority of the states follow an indirect election system for the mayors. However, a few states such as Uttarakhand, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, UP, etc. provide that the mayors should be elected directly by the voters for a 5-year term. Now, basically, the municipal corporation has 3 authorities, namely the council, the standing committee, and the commissioner. Now, this municipal council is basically the deliberative or the legislative wing of the corporation. So, it is this council which makes the various laws for urban governance. Now, the members of this council are elected directly by the people. Now, this council is basically headed by the mayor. And this mayor is elected by these councillors. Hence, the election to the office of the mayor is through indirect election because the mayor is elected by the councillors, who in turn are directly elected by the people. Furthermore, the mayor is elected for a 1-year term. Now, the main function of the mayor is to preside over the meetings of the council. Now, the standing committee is basically created to facilitate the working of the council. So the standing committee deals with various public works, education, health, etc. And then they take decisions in their respective field. However, the real power lies with the municipal commissioner. Now, this municipal commissioner is responsible for the implementation of all the decisions. Hence, he is the real executive power and he is generally appointed by the state government concerned. So this is basically how a municipal corporation works. On the same lines, we have a municipality also, and this municipality is for administration of towns and smaller city. Here also they follow 3 sets of authorities, namely the council, the standing committee and the chief executive officer. The only difference here is that the council here is headed by a president or a chairman. And unlike the mayor, the president or the chairman has a much more significant role to play and is rather the central point of the municipal administration because he enjoys certain executive powers as well, unlike the mayor, because mayor is only a titular or a ceremonial head. However, the president or chairman of the municipality has much more executive powers as compared to the mayor. Last, of course, is the chief executive officer, who is appointed by the state government, and he is responsible for the day-to-day general administration of the municipality. So basically, this is how our urban local bodies function. So please remember that currently the mayor is elected indirectly by the city councillors who are themselves elected directly by the people. However, he is just the titular head and the real power resides with the municipal commissioner who is appointed by the government. So now the reforms which are being demanded is, of course, firstly that the office of the mayor should be a directly elected one with a fixed term of 5 years. Furthermore, this election should be held on non-party lines, which means that people who do not belong to any party should be allowed to contest this election. And of course, there is a demand that real and much more substantive powers should be given to the mayor. Now, certain reasons cited for this reform is first that it will improve the political accountability. Since the office of the mayor will be directly elected, it will enjoy a greater amount of legitimacy, and the mayor in turn will be accountable to the people as well. And the improvement in the political accountability will help to improve the efficiency and the management of the urban local bodies. Additionally, this will also resolve the power tussles between the mayor and the municipal commissioner. Furthermore, the fixed tenure for the mayors will offer a greater continuity and will provide much more stability as opposed to the current system where bureaucrats are appointed as commissioners and then they are abruptly transferred. Hence, the fixed tenure will offer more stability because the person will not be dependent on the elected members of the council or on the local or the state level political leadership for his survival in the office, because he is getting his mandate directly from the people. Furthermore, in the current model, it is seen that the councillor elections are held at the ward level and they are rather based on hyper-local issues. And many a times, these hyper-local issues do not resonate with the whole city. Hence, a directly elected mayor will ensure that the entire focus is on the problems which concern the entire city and not just a few specific wards. Next, as far as holding the election on non-party lines is concerned, the current problem is that in the present scheme of things, it is the chief ministers who do not want a very strong urban local body chief to emerge. The reason is obviously that they feel challenged by their authority. Hence, this is the reason why a lot of political parties prefer indirect elections for the mayors. However, if these polls are held on non-party lines with direct elections for the chief or the head of the urban local bodies, the chief ministers will not feel threatened or challenged by the authorities of these ULB heads, because they will be contesting elections on non-party lines. Hence, there is no question that they can challenge the authority of the chief minister. Furthermore, this will also encourage a new crop of leaders to emerge who will be well educated and well qualified. Additionally, it will also encourage the youngsters to take part in the election process. The next advantage is that municipal elections will become much more cheaper, because then there will be no need for any political party to spend money to counter the nominees of the rival party, which usually happens in other elections as well. Moreover, if the mayors do not perform well, then the political representatives of those areas, including the MLA or the MP, will not be held responsible for the wrongdoing of the mayor, because the mayor is now being directly elected by the people and will be directly accountable to the people. Last but not the least, we require this direct election for the mayor so that we can have a much more efficient and meaningful decentralization. Because even today, the mayor remains a mere figurehead with limited financial and functional independence. And the real power resides with the state government, which runs the city through the municipal commissioner. And it is only through decentralization that we will be able to empower the urban local bodies in the real meaningful sense. However, achieving all of this is easier said than done, because there are certain challenges which lie ahead before all these reforms can be implemented. The first is that state governments are themselves very reluctant to delegate any more authority to city level institutions. So even if the mayor becomes a directly elected office, the state governments can refuse to devolve any more powers and resources to the mayor, thereby effectively reducing him again to a figurehead. Second issue is of the overlapping powers with the municipal commissioners. Because even if some powers are delegated to the mayor, the state governments have in place the municipal commissioners who perform the executive functions. Hence, again here, the municipal commissioners can downsize the power of the mayor, regardless of the fact whether mayor's office is a direct or an indirect one. The third issue is that many a times, when a mayor executes the projects, he tends to become popular, that too at the expense of the local legislator, whose job was to make laws and scrutinize the performance of the executive. Hence, there is always a possibility that the local legislator will see the directly elected mayor as a competition and will feel threatened by him and will always try to undercut his authority. Last but not the least, It is also said that having an elected mayor will blur the lines between the three tiers of government, that is the union, state and the local self-government. Because at the union level, the members of the Lok Sabha are directly elected. At the state level, the member of the state legislative assembly are directly elected. And at the local level, the councillors or the member of the councils are directly elected. Now, in addition to having directly elected members of the council, if the mayor's office also becomes a directly elected one, it is likely to blur the lines between the three tiers of government. Therefore, what needs to be done is that currently only the state governments should confer the necessary powers on the mayor to discharge his duties much more effectively. Secondly, voter awareness also needs to be generated because it is the only way a person will be motivated to vote for a mayor based on their executive performance. Thirdly, in order to check the spread of vested interest of the councillors, the mayor should be vested with the power to veto any resolution passed by the councillors. With this, we come to an end for today's discussion. Let's take up the question for the day.